10 minutes. And Bojana, maybe you just say after about 10 minutes or so, I think that's enough, Alan.
To be punctual.
To be punctual, yeah. I'll start with the punctual. The first paid job I had was in an office filling in some numbers in a form. And the numbers counted the days between something had come into the country, in this case the United Kingdom, and the day on which the tax was paid on the product. It was a job in an organisation called the Civil Service, which is an interesting title. It's not really to do with civility, but perhaps it's about the civility of social service. And I had to be as accurate as I could, because the punctuality of the reporting of the good was important. So the good that was being imported to the country was being recorded. And it was being recorded in terms of a delay. Are you understanding? The good would come into a port, and you'd know the day on which the good had arrived, and then the tax would be paid at a date that was later. And the numbers that were going onto the page were the numbers that recorded the gap between these two actions. And I recall a red line was drawn, it's pre-computer, I'm way before that, underneath by my higher executive officer, who took from me the sheets, any number over 100. Any number over 100 days was due for fine. And I was interested in this demand for punctuality with goods. So when Joe talks about the punctual, this is the job that comes to mind. Now, this memory is not of the present. It's the first job I had. So it's 35 years ago, first paid work I had. And it can't be of the present, because the memory of the present that I have that Joe talks about is currently in a state of disrepair. I think Joe's aware, a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, where were we? In Zagreb, Joe, where you set up the school.
Yeah.
And what was the school
School
called?
of Sisyphus.
Joe set up, anyone who was at PSI in Zagreb, a School of Sisyphus. And I volunteered to teach at this school as long as my tutorials could be called the reverse tutorial. That people would come and tell me or remind me what it was I said to them some time ago. The reason that I set the reverse tutorial up was I couldn't recall much of what I'd been saying in the recent past. Which I think is a condition that people throughout their lives begin to experience. I'm not going to say suffer. It's not necessarily a suffering, simply a kind of deconstruction of your expectation of what you can recall. I mean, there are names for it, dementia or Alzheimer's, but these are draconian words to describe a process where the memory of the present gives way to recollection of long memories, much longer ones, like my first job, which comes to mind when Joe talks about punctuality. So they're the first two things that come to mind, and they're anecdotal, because some of you who've heard me speak before will know that I hide behind formal paper. I'll often read a paper in a very formal way, and people say, Alan, why did you read a paper to us when you could have talked to us? And I'm quite nervous about what would happen if I was to do what I'm doing now, which is to respond in the current, in the moment, in the present, with a memory that's really beginning to, in some ways, sort of destabilize in quite an interesting way. So that's the first thought about punctuality. And I just want us to remember the economy of memories of the present are physical and material, as well as potentially quite conceptual and metaphoric. And I'm not for a moment suggesting Joe is using terms metaphorically. What I love in Joe's writing is a constant attention to material presence. A memory that's very close to the one therefore a little bit weight. Listening to Joe makes me want to turn these pieces of paper the other way. So I wrote some things on the plane, like Joe. I didn't give it as much thought as he did. I wasn't thinking last night about this, but it makes me just want to respond to Joe here, which is what I'll do. Back is also about suffering. When Joe said, to suffer is to allow, I felt in the room a change in the atmosphere, or klima, the climate. And I think that was because that was true, and it was not something I'd thought about. But I ran a theatre in London, in the Docklands area, from 1981 to 1991, for 10 years. And the theatre was in a place I never understood. It was in a building on the river, just by Tower Bridge, in a place called Hope, Sufferance, Wharf. Now, an English wharf is a building where boats come and discharge their goods. The goods, I recalled that just a few years before, in my first paid work, I was recording, the delay of which were going to bring a fine for the people who brought them to the country. And this place, Hope Sufferance Wharf, I never understood till now. I didn't realise sufferance or suffering could mean an allowance, or something was allowed. And I realised that this theatre was in a warehouse, which must have had some kind of licence that allowed it to take goods outside the common economy in some way. I'm guessing now. I suppose I thought sufferance was something to do with the condition of the workers in the theatre which I ran. That was, we called it a workshop, but the mothers in the area said, don't call it a workshop, a theatre workshop, because a workshop is a place where people can be injured, and we can't bring our young people to your theatre if they can be injured, just like our uncles and fathers and grandfathers were in the building that you're now running as a theatre. So I'd sort of thought of sufferance as a suffering, or a place or a site of being ill at ease, which was uncomfortable running a theatre in that setting. But Joe's just alerted me to the possibility there was something perhaps more positive about this suffering, a sufferance which is an allowance outside the convention of goods, which maybe mean goods can remain for longer in a place. They can be cared for. So that a bureaucrat like me a few years earlier wouldn't draw a red line under the good at the point at which the tax was not paid after 100 days. And I think that might be something to do with where we're sitting. Because I think Veem, Bojana tells me, means Veem.
Veem, yeah.
And
storage place.
A storage place, so Hetveem, a storage place. And I suspect that this architecture was built as a site for transition or things in transit. Would that be possible?
Yeah, it is not a permanent storage place. It is where things were coming from the ships, getting in here, but not entering the country, but actually being shipped further. So
I love that. So Hope Sufferance Wharf, you can go and visit it. The name's on the building, by Tower Bridge in London, just by St Mary's Church, nestling next to a very good pub called the Mayflower, where some pilgrims set out to go to a place called America some 100 years ago. So that little space is perhaps economically linked and ethically linked to this space in a peculiar way, to do with a place of transit where goods, services, but perhaps images, possibilities are suffered or allowed. Am I at my 10 minutes yet, Bojana?
no.
Oh. Caves.
shit.